And there's a straight lead-in directly from that. There's a causal relationship between death and sin. So now we all recognize, we all get on the same page with God. Death's the enemy. Death's God's enemy before it was our enemy. Now let's all conspire together to undo death. The way we're going to undo death is we're going to undo the power of sin. Well, how do we do that? Jesus and his resurrection. It's good to be with everybody. I suppose that you all know, Chloe and I were in Minneapolis this last week. We had planned to go out for just a few days. Just so you know a little bit about the church out there, it's two families that left the colony the same night that Joshua did, who are our seed families in Minneapolis and the church there. A couple other people have joined them since. And when they left, both Matt's wife and Jerome's wife were pregnant, expecting babies in December. They were both born. And just over a week ago, they were having a prayer meeting and they went in the room to check on the baby, and Laura's baby was dead. So that was Thursday night, and we heard about it Friday morning. It was late at night when all that happened. I got a message early Friday morning, so when I flew out there, we expected to have a soon burial and come home. Ended up being there for the week. And it occurs to me that we are a demographically very young church. Death isn't a lot of our experience. It's not a lot of mine. I've been to only a handful of Christian burials in my life. I don't come from a large community, and if I try to think back, I've probably been to 3 funerals in my life before this one. Never a child, and never people I was this close connected to or felt any sense of responsibility for. So I've been thinking a lot about death. I should tell you that for all of the heartache and sorrow, it was really a very amazing experience. That's kind of what I want to talk about. I want to deal with a couple of things. I spoke on death there last Sunday because there's a lot of misunderstandings that people have about death. I feel like in my background, growing up in the evangelical church, a lot of times the death from the Christian viewpoint was wielded kind of like a threat. Like, that's how we get people saved, right? We threaten them that they're going to face the judgment and you're going to die someday. And like we had these videos we'd watch in Sunday school and youth group, and you're going to die, you're going to die, you're going to die. You better be ready. You better be ready. You better be ready. And that was the whole kind of thrust of the church's concept of death. And then if you mix with that a heavy dose of sovereignty and predestination and determinism, you come away with this idea that God is kind of like the divine sniper, like he's up in heaven shooting people with death arrows, and I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to kill you, I won't kill you, and I will kill you. That's kind of like I don't know what you guys' experience was, but that's kind of how I grew up with this understanding of death as it pertains to God. I've been uncomfortable with that for a long time. Doctrinally, there's a lot of things that have corrected some of that narrative, but I've never really taken the time to reprocess what does death look like from the church's perspective? What place does death hold? And the reason it's important is because when you're confronted with death, we have a lot of wrong ideas. So one of them is this, right? What we say is, when we hear of the death, especially of a child, hold your loved ones closer, hold your children closer, give thanks to God. That's all okay as far as that's concerned. But then, okay, so I hear about a death, and so I go home and I scoop up my babies in my arms and I hold them close and I say, thank you, God. Thank you for my babies. I love them. But then what does that mean for the bereaved? Does God not love them because their baby's gone? Because their child's not here? Because their mother or father has passed? One of the few funerals I was in, and probably the only other really like our kind of people, Christian funerals I was in, was a mother who lost 7 children. Okay, go sit down, Bubba. Go sit down by Mama. Scoop up your babies. A mother with 7 children. Her youngest couldn't have been 2, maybe 2. She died of stomach cancer. She was a Korean woman. And I remember going to her funeral, and I remember the things that people said to that family. I remember them saying, God has a plan, God has a plan, God has a plan, and trying to comfort these little children that their mother is in a casket by saying, God knows, God has a plan for all this, God's doing something here. You can't see it, but we know God's at work. And I thought back then, if I'm that child, and the church is telling me, God wanted my mother dead, what does that do to my feeling about God? How do you not feel like God becomes your enemy that day? Why does God want my mother dead? Why does he want her more than I want her? Why does he need her more than I want her? And we hear this a lot from people who are bereaved, that this animosity begins to build between God because I can't figure out the plan, right? And so then I have to just put it in some mystery category where somehow this makes sense to God, but it doesn't make sense to any of us, that a child is in a coffin. Turn with me to Hebrews chapter 2. What I would like to do, I have two major things that I want to communicate today. I want to talk about this issue of death, and I want to talk about what the implications of a proper view of death are. Let's start in chapter 2 of Hebrews, and we'll start in verse 5. Okay? This is deep stuff, so I might make some commentary as we go just to add some clarifying remarks. But let's read through. Starting in verse 5. For unto the angels hath he not put in subjection the world to come, whereof we speak. So the angels are not the ones who the world is being put in subjection to. But one in a certain place testified, saying, What is man that thou art mindful of him? Or the Son of Man that thou visitest him? I've made this prayer many times. Like, why do you care about man? Why are we this object of special affection for God? Why is his spirit with us? Why does he not have interest in the birds or the bears? But man is this particular interest of the creation, this particular delight of God. And he's willing to strive and struggle and strain with men. And the angels wondered that too, apparently. Because one of them said, What is man that thou art mindful of him? Thou madest him a little lower than the angels. Thou crownedst him with glory and honor, and didst set him over the work of thy hands. Thou hast put all things in subjection under his feet, for in that he put all in subjection under him, he left nothing that is not put under him. But now we see not yet all things are put under him, but we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, should taste death for every man. For it became him, for whom we are all things, and by whom we are all things, in bringing many sons unto glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For both he that sanctifieth and they who are sanctified are all of one, which cause he is not ashamed to call them brethren, saying, I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the church will I sing praise unto thee. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children which God hath given me. For as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part in the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is, the devil. The author of Hebrews puts the one who has power over death, not as God, as the devil. The devil is the one who holds power of death. The devil is the death sniper. I'm not saying the devil is involved in every particular death. What I'm saying is that the cause, the reason, the root, the antecedent, where death comes from, is from the devil. That he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver them, who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. For verily, he took not on him the nature of angels, but he took on him the seed of Abraham. Wherefore in all things it behooved him to be made like unto his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make reconciliation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself hath suffered being tempted, he is able to succor them that are tempted. When we look cosmically at death, it does not go on the God side of the equation. God, in several places throughout the New Testament, enumerates specifically death as his enemy. See, death is the problem. Death is what God's whole plan and work is trying to undo. Adam and the serpent conspire together to create death in the garden and ruin God's creation. And the stamp of death, the fingerprint of death on every single person born since Adam and Eve, every single person that's born that shame and indignity in God's creation have been a slight and an insult and a defamation of God's creation. And it is well nigh to blasphemy to make God the object of death. I think people do this in ignorance. I'm sure they do. But it's a wrong way to sum the equation. Death is everything God's trying to undo. When you see the little child whose mother is in a coffin, you don't say, God wanted this to happen. You just have to figure out how to make sense of it. You say, God hates this just like you do. God hurts just like you do. God's weeping just like you are. This is an insult to him and it's an insult to you. Let's work together with him to undo death. That's the Christian message around death. And there's a straight lead-in directly from that. There's a causal relationship between death and sin. So now we all recognize, we all get on the same page with God. Death's the enemy. Death's God's enemy before it was our enemy. Now let's all conspire together to undo death. The way we're going to undo death is we're going to undo the power of sin. Well, how do we do that? Jesus and his resurrection. That's how we undo the power of sin. And undo the power of sin, you undo the power of death. And O death, where's thy sting? And O grave, where's thy victory? Because the strength of death is sin. I I was thinking about all the experiences of the last week, and it was so very much an honor to be there. There are things that I learned about grieving and about the Christian response to death that made me so proud of God's people. That made me feel so encouraged. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. I was interested too, like when we went out there, I don't know what we're supposed to do. Like I'm the church planter that's supposed to help these guys do church. Now I show up and they've got a dead baby. And what does a funeral look like? What are we going to do? I've never done this before. They've obviously never done this before. So we sit down and we say, well, what do you want? I mean, I'm trying to be sensitive to, their culture and custom, where they're coming from, what they think is normal, what they want to have happen, but they're also completely disjointed from their culture. They left the colony. So that's only of a little bit of value. And so where we settle on is that the family wants to have a wake with the casket in the home. They want to have a funeral in the morning, and they want to bury the child in the afternoon. And so we move forward in that direction, and there are these moments throughout the week that are just crushing. And as I went through that week, and as we finished all of those obligations, I thought in my mind, well, what would it have looked like for this family if they were my neighbor? If they're my neighbor in the world and they have a death like this, it looks like, the paramedics come to your house and they take a body away, and then you have all this sorrow and loss, and then you go to this creepy, velvety, distanced funeral home for an hour and a half, and people come and cry. And then you get in a car and you go to this sterilized scene of a grass mat graveyard, and your child goes down in a hole and disappears, and that's it. And that's wholly unsatisfying to me. What was so powerful is to bring that casket in a Christian home and to look at death in the face and to keep walking forward. It really was a living testimony of, oh, death, where's thy sting? Because they're able to not just, I feel like so much of our culture's custom around death is sterilization. How do we distance? How do we outsource? How do we get away from it? How do we keep it out of our home? How do we create an environment where we have to think about it as little as possible? And here over this last week, I got to watch a family look at full in the face, no hiding, no running away, no sterilization, no trying to pretend like it's not there. Just a full-on clash between life and death in a Christian home. And the saints were the victors. It gave me a lot to think about the grieving process, and what is the purpose of all of that? What do we do in death? How do we mark it, and how do we observe it, and how do we deal with it? And I realized a bunch of things that are just, I think, useful for us to consider. I hope you all don't have to consider it for a very long time. But if you ever do, I think there's something about the idea of a long process of in-home grieving with close people who you love and care for you, with a multi-day period of time with people around, this unhindered ebb and flow of sorrow and grief and crying. But there's something about the human spirit that you can only cry so many tears. And after you've cried all the tears for that hour or for that day, there's these little punctuated moments of brevity, of life, of children, of food, of laughter, even laughter. And it's like if you take these windows and you cover them with black so that no light can come through, that's death. No light. There's nothing good in this situation. No light can come through. It's so horrible. But you just start poking little holes in it. Just a little needle hole at a time. Like there's a child that runs up and kisses its mother. Or there's another baby that the grieving mother gets to hold and rejoice. Or ask her about her child and see her eyes light up in remembrance. And it starts to let light in. And you start to think, well, maybe something this horrible, even this we can overcome. And it's so empowering to feel like in those moments that we're not under God's choice to kill our loved ones, but that He's grieving with us. Not just grieving with us, but grieving as a father who's lost a son. Someone who knows sacrifice and loss and suffering and pain. That living testimony, being with those brothers and sisters and seeing the church care for one another and minister to one another, and like this regular walking in grace, this regular experience with peace out of the midst of sorrow. I don't know how to even describe it. I don't know how to quantify that. Except for overwhelming, awesome, terrible. There's something that I learned about the power of weeping with those that weep. To be in a situation where you weep is bad. But to weep and be alone is the worst. If I have to weep, I want to weep with my people. And if I have joy, I want to have joy with my people. The thing that I spoke on some of these things before last week, and so I'm not trying to rehash all that, but the thing that I wanted to bring up about this today is that I feel like if there's one thing I could do to convince someone of the truth and veracity of the gospel of Jesus Christ, if I could just show them what happened the last week. Like I'm not an anti-intellectual, all of you know that, but there's only so much you can do with arguing with people. I had somebody, a friend of mine who's a Muslim convert. He's an American, but he converted to Islam, and he wanted to have an argument with me on social media. Kind of goes through these ebbs and flows, and I had posted something on Facebook, and he wanted to argue with me about, I don't remember what it was, something about whether or not, what was his complaint? It was basically the divinity of Christ. He was sure from the Quran that couldn't be so, and that the Bible couldn't be true, the New Testament record couldn't be true, and he was trying to drag me into this textual debate. And I didn't even, I to be quite honest, I didn't have time or the energy to deal with it. What I told him was the story of the man who was given his sight by Christ. And I said, if Jesus gives you sight when you're blind, nothing about what you're talking about matters. It just doesn't matter. You can argue till you're blue in the face about the Quran or textual criticism of the Gospels. I don't care. I mean, I care about you, but I don't care about what you're saying, because I was a blind man who got my eyes, and I know who did it. And there's something about that kind of argument to watch this family overcome. And I was suspicious, right? Because I'm afraid. I'm there pastorally for these people who I love very much. And I'm worried because we're having these moments from time to time where there's laughter in the home. And I'm like, can you laugh? Can you be at peace? Can you sit around a table and drink a glass of wine and eat some bread and have a normal conversation when your child is in a coffin? Is that possible? Is it just like, is it a psychological trick? Is it just avoidance? Is it just like try to pretend like it's not here? Is it just numbness? I'm trying to evaluate, but it's not. It's not, because everything's on the table. Everything's being talked about. There's no avoidance and there's no running away. We're here to deal with it. And in these moments, there's real peace and real joy. And I don't believe that anything can produce that but grace. And if I could bottle that sentiment, if I could communicate that peace, that's the apologetic of the faith. That's the thing that beats death. That's the thing that's greater than the worst thing that can happen. That's the power of God in a broken world. I watched Jerome, the child's father, stand up at a funeral and share his gratitude for his son's life. And I watched him close his speaking at his own son. I could barely get through it. It wasn't my child. I watched him speak at his own son's funeral and close with the psalm that says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is in me. Bless his holy name." And what do you do to a man like that? How can you stop that? When a man can stand in front of his child's coffin and say, "Bless the Lord, O my soul," there's nothing in the world that anybody can do that, man. He's free. He's free in Christ and in the power of the resurrection. He has a hope and a grace that's bigger than all of that. And that's a God that has to be real. That's a gospel that has to be true. And that's a testimony of a Christ who beat death, conquered. So I was thinking about this passage in Hebrews. I don't know if it's the moment that I've been going through or what, but as I'm thinking about this passage here and in John and other places where this message of the high priest, of the one who's like us, comes through again and again, it oftentimes mentions his death or his suffering. Like that's the key to him being our high priest. That's the key to his identification with us. That's why he can call us brother, and he's not ashamed of us because he's walked through the indignity and the shame and the reproach to the creation that death is. He goes all the way down into and back up the other side. And it feels kind of dumb to say it because that's so much a part of our theology. But until you watch somebody actually stare death in the face and beat it and come out the stronger side of it, stronger than death, it's just not the same. It feels like the words take on new meanings. How do we comfort people? We comfort people. Here's the point. This is what Hebrews is trying to do. It's trying to comfort us with his place as a high priest. It's trying to comfort us by saying he understands. And the place to meet people, the place to meet the bereaved, the place to meet the suffering, the place to meet the oppressed is not with the Islamic inshallah. God wills it. God has a plan. God knows what you don't. The place to meet the weak, the place to meet the hurt and the desperate is with a God who hated those things more than they do and became weak and desperate and hurting and sorrowful and dead to prove the point. And it just causes me to shudder when people try to blame God for those things that he's fought so hard to undo and to change the value of. I think that's it. I just wanted to share those things this week with you all. I needed to kind of debrief and unload some of that off of my heart. Thank you for listening and hearing me out, and I hope we have the right resources to help people in need when times come.